Segment 5. The Final Mysteries of the Nile. We return one last time to ancient Egypt, to gather the final threads of understanding, the last whispers of this civilization that flourished and faded. The moon rises high over the desert now. The stars wheel in their eternal patterns. Let these final facts wash over you like water from the Nile, carrying you deeper into rest, into the peaceful darkness where all stories eventually end. Fact 41. The hairdressers and their social power. In a culture obsessed with elaborate hairstyles and wigs, hairdressers wielded surprising influence. They worked primarily for wealthy women, spending hours creating intricate braids, curls, and extensions. A skilled hairdresser might work exclusively for one noble household, becoming a trusted intimate who knew all the family's secrets. While working on someone's hair, a process that could take an entire afternoon, clients would talk freely, discussing things they wouldn't mention to anyone else. Hairdressers heard about affairs, political schemes, family tensions, business dealings. They were mobile repositories of gossip, connecting different households through the information they carried. Some became advisors to their clients, offering opinions on everything from marriage prospects to political alliances. The relationship was intimate in a way modern people might struggle to understand. The hairdresser's hands in your hair for hours, the vulnerability of sitting still while being transformed, the trust required. Young girls from good families were sometimes apprenticed to master hairdressers, learning not just the craft but the discretion required. A hairdresser who betrayed confidences would lose all clients. But one who kept secrets, who offered wise counsel, who could create beauty from unruly hair. Such a person became invaluable, sometimes wealthier and more influential than the minor nobles they served. Fact 42. The shadow and its sacred importance. Ancient Egyptians believed a person consisted of multiple spiritual elements. The Ka, life force, the Ba, personality soul, and also the Shut, the shadow. Your shadow wasn't just an optical effect of light blocked by your body. It was a vital part of your being, a spiritual double that could be damaged or lost. To be without a shadow meant death or worse. Magicians claimed they could capture someone's shadow to harm them. Some protective spells specifically guarded one's shadow. In tomb paintings, the deceased is always shown with their shadow carefully rendered, ensuring it would accompany them to the afterlife. Children were taught not to step on shadows unnecessarily. To do so was disrespectful, potentially harmful. Lovers would sometimes arrange to meet where their shadows touched or overlapped, a form of contact before physical touching. The shadow was considered evidence of your substance, your reality. Ghosts and demons were sometimes thought to be shadowless, which is how you could identify them. On the other hand, to cast a strong, clear shadow meant you were fully alive, fully present, blessed by Ra, the sun god. People were conscious of their shadows throughout the day, watching how they lengthened at evening, disappeared at noon when the sun was directly overhead, that brief terrifying moment of shadowlessness that some found unsettling. In a land defined by intense sun and sharp contrast between light and dark, the shadow became a theological concept, a philosophical question, and a daily companion. Fact 43. The salt trade and natron mines. Natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, was essential to Egyptian civilization. Found in dried lake beds, particularly in the Wadi Natron, this salt had countless uses. It was used for mummification, drawing moisture from bodies. It was used in cleaning clothes, dishes, even teeth. It was used in making faience, the beautiful blue-glazed pottery. It was used in medicine and food preservation. Workers at the Natron Mines labored in harsh conditions, harvesting the crusty white deposits, packing them for transport. This wasn't glamorous work. The salt was caustic, burning skin and eyes. The desert mines were remote, hot, and dangerous. But the product was so valuable that entire communities devoted themselves to natron production. Trade caravans would carry natron throughout Egypt and beyond, and fortunes were made in salt. The miners themselves were often paid in natron, which they could trade for other goods. Some became skilled at identifying the best quality natron, commanding higher prices. Temple complexes required enormous amounts for purification rituals and mummification. Every home needed it for cleaning. The humble white crust of dried lake beds was one of the foundations of Egyptian civilization, as important as grain or gold, extracted by people whose names we'll never know but whose labor made everything else possible. Fact 44. The Festival of Lights. Once a year, during the Festival of Lights at Sais, every Egyptian household would light oil lamps and place them outside their homes, in windows, along rooftops. Even the poorest families would light at least one small lamp. The entire country became a constellation. Houses transformed into earthbound stars. This festival honored Neith, the ancient goddess of weaving and war, and commemorated the creation of the world. People would stay up all night, keeping their lamps burning, eating special foods, telling stories. Children would run through streets lit by thousands of flickering flames, playing games that were only played on this one night. Young people would use the festival as an opportunity for romance, meeting in the lamplit darkness with more freedom than usual. The next morning, exhausted and satisfied, people would extinguish their lamps, clean up the oil soot, and return to normal life. But for one night Egypt glowed. Travelers on the Nile would see entire villages sparkling in the darkness. From the desert, cities looked like they were on fire with gentle, golden light. It was magic created not by priests or pharaohs but by ordinary people, each contributing their small flame to a greater illumination. The festival reminded everyone that individual lights, however small, could together transform darkness into something beautiful. That collective action, everyone lighting one lamp, could change the world at least for a night. Fact 45. The geriatric care and honoring elders. Ancient Egypt had no nursing homes, no assisted living facilities. The elderly were cared for by family, and this wasn't just custom, it was legal and moral obligation. Children who failed to care for aging parents could be disinherited and socially condemned. Old age was respected, and the elderly held positions of honor. A man with gray hair was called the Venerable One, and his opinions were sought in disputes. Elderly women, especially those who had survived many births and raised children successfully, were considered wise and were consulted on matters of health, childbirth, and child-rearing. Grandparents lived with their children, helping raise grandchildren, telling stories, passing down knowledge. Medical texts include remedies specifically for conditions of old age, treatments for stiff joints, failing eyesight, memory loss. One papyrus contains a recipe to transform an old man into a youth, a mixture of herbs that supposedly restored vigor, suggesting both respect for age and desire to relieve its burdens. Tomb inscriptions often praise the deceased for having achieved old age, for having been cared for by devoted children, for dying surrounded by family. The fear wasn't death itself but dying alone, uncared for, forgotten. Egyptian culture built elaborate systems, legal, social, and spiritual, to ensure that those who had lived long and contributed much would be honored and comfortable in their final years. Old age was a victory, and those who achieved it deserved reverence and care. Fact 46. The secret gardens of the wealthy. Behind high walls, the wealthy cultivated private gardens that were oases of green in the desert landscape. These weren't purely decorative. They were carefully planned ecosystems combining beauty, food production, and spiritual significance. A typical wealthy garden would have a rectangular pool at its center, stocked with lotus flowers and fish. Around the pool, date palms provided shade and fruit. Fig trees, pomegranates, and sycamores offered both food and coolness. Grape vines climbed on pergolas, creating shaded walkways. Vegetables grew in neat plots. Onions, lettuce, cucumbers, melons. Flowers bloomed in season: cornflowers, poppies, and mandrakes. These gardens required constant labor. Water had to be carried from the Nile or wells, sometimes using shadow mechanisms to lift water to irrigation channels. Gardeners worked daily, knowing each plant's needs. The wealthy would retreat to their gardens for privacy, for romance, for contemplation. Tomb paintings often show the deceased in their garden, suggesting they hoped to have such spaces in the afterlife. These gardens were status symbols, certainly, but also genuine refuges. In the heat of Egyptian summer, to sit under a fig tree beside cool water, surrounded by green growing things and the scent of flowers, was luxury almost beyond measure. The garden represented humanity's ability to impose order and beauty on chaos, to make the desert bloom through patient labor and precious water. Fact 47. The brothels and sacred prostitution. Sex work existed in ancient Egypt in various forms, though evidence is scattered and sometimes controversial. There were women who worked in taverns and beer houses, providing companionship and sex to customers. These establishments were common in cities and near military garrisons. The women weren't necessarily slaves or outcasts. Some chose this work, some were forced into it by poverty. Egyptian society seems to have been more pragmatic than moralistic about commercial sex. It existed, it was utilized, it wasn't heavily legislated. More complex is the question of sacred prostitution. Some temples, particularly those devoted to Hathor, may have employed women who performed sexual acts as part of religious rituals. The evidence is debated. Some scholars believe this happened, others think it's a misinterpretation of temple servants who danced and made music. What's clearer is that sexuality itself wasn't considered shameful. Fertility was sacred, and practices that honored or invoked fertility had religious dimensions. The line between sacred and profane sexuality was blurrier than in later cultures. What matters is that women in these situations had varying degrees of choice and protection. Some sex workers accumulated wealth and independence. Others were exploited. Egyptian law provided some protections. Rape was punishable, including of sex workers. Women could own property and keep their earnings. It wasn't liberation by modern standards, but neither was it the complete degradation that sex work meant in some other ancient cultures. Fact 48. The tomb robbers and their trials. Despite elaborate curses and security measures, tomb robbery was rampant in ancient Egypt. The treasures buried with the dead were too tempting. Organized gangs, sometimes including the very workers who had built and sealed the tombs, would break in under cover of darkness. They knew exactly where the valuables were located. The robbery wasn't quick. Thieves would spend hours in the tomb, carefully collecting gold, jewels, and valuable oils, sometimes even unwrapping mummies to get at amulets wrapped in the bandages. This was dangerous work, both practically and spiritually. The tombs were designed to be difficult to enter, with blocked passages and false doors. And then there were the curses, promises of divine vengeance against those who disturbed the dead. Some robbers were caught, and the trial records that survive are fascinating. The accused would be tortured to extract confessions, describing in detail how they broke in, what they took, how they divided the spoils. Punishments were severe: impalement, mutilation, or forced labor in mines. Yet tomb robbery continued throughout Egyptian history because the rewards were so great. In a strange way, the robbers and the tomb builders were locked in an eternal contest, one side trying to protect the dead's wealth for eternity, the other trying to steal it. Most ancient tombs we find today have been robbed in antiquity. The treasures meant for the afterlife funded the lives of thieves, a redistribution of wealth that priests and pharaohs could never prevent, despite their best efforts and most terrifying curses. Fact 49. The Papyrus Makers and their craft. Papyrus, the writing material that gave Egypt a voice across centuries, was made through a labor-intensive process by skilled craftspeople. The papyrus plant grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, tall reeds with feathery tops. Workers would harvest these reeds, cut them to size, and strip away the outer rind to reach the fibrous white pith inside. This pith was sliced into thin strips. The strips were laid side by side on a flat surface, then another layer was laid perpendicular on top. The sheets were then beaten with mallets, the plant's natural starches and moisture causing the layers to bond together. After pressing and drying in the sun, the result was a smooth, flexible writing surface. A single papyrus sheet could be made, or many sheets could be glued end to end to create scrolls dozens of feet long. The quality varied. Fine papyrus for important documents was smooth and thin, while cheaper grades were coarser. Papyrus makers formed guilds, protecting their techniques. The best papyrus was exported throughout the ancient world, making fortunes for those who controlled production. This humble plant, processed by skilled hands, preserved Egyptian literature, science, administration, and magic. Without papyrus makers, we would know almost nothing of ancient Egypt. Their work, cutting, stripping, laying, beating, pressing, drying, created the medium through which an entire civilization spoke to the future. Fact 50. The last breath and the opening of the mouth. When an Egyptian died, the journey to the afterlife began with specific rituals. The body would be washed and prepared for mummification. But before the tomb was sealed, one final ceremony was essential: the opening of the mouth. A priest would use special ritual instruments, an adze, a knife, to symbolically touch the mouth, eyes, nose, and ears of the mummy. This ritual restored the deceased's ability to see, hear, smell, speak, and eat in the afterlife. Without this ceremony, the dead person would be helpless in the next world, unable to declare their innocence before Osiris, unable to enjoy the offerings left for them. The ritual included recitations from sacred texts, offerings of incense, and sometimes the sacrifice of an ox, whose leg was touched to the mummy's mouth to transfer life force. Family members would stand watching, weeping, as the priest performed these final services. The ceremony was expensive, but even moderately wealthy families would pay for it, knowing that without the opening of the mouth, all the other preparations, the mummification, the tomb, the grave goods, would be useless. The dead person would be trapped in their body, silenced forever. So the priest would chant, would touch the ritual tools to painted lips, and would pronounce the formula: "Your mouth is opened. You shall speak. You shall live again." And with those words, the deceased was released from the imprisonment of death, freed to enter eternity. And so our journey through ancient Egypt reaches its end. 50 facts, 50 glimpses into lives lived millennia ago along the banks of the Nile. We have walked through their days and nights, tasted their bread and beer, felt their love and grief, witnessed their labor and their rest. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. By remembering these details of their lives, the mundane and the magnificent, we have brought them briefly back, honored them, connected with their humanity across the vast gulf of time. Now it is time to release them, to let them return to their sleep in the Western lands. Time for you too to sleep. You have traveled far tonight, through markets and temples, along the Nile, through gardens and tombs. You have seen the sunrise over desert sands and watched stars wheel overhead. You have learned that people who lived thousands of years ago were not so different from you. They loved and worried, worked and rested, hoped and feared, just as you do. Let all these images drift away now like boats disappearing downstream. The perfume cones have melted. The beer has been drunk. The lamps have been extinguished. The Nile flows on in darkness, as it always has, as it always will. Rest now deeply and completely. Sleep as the ancient Egyptians slept, trusting that morning will come again, that life continues, that you are part of an endless human story stretching back to the beginning and forward to the unknown future. The desert is quiet. The stars are bright. All is well. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep peacefully. Good night.